I'm talking to my friend Richard Eskow from Campaign for America's Future, ourfuture.org. Let's move on, actually, because we were talking about, those who believe in the sanctity of free markets. You actually had another really, really funny piece. It's also very depressing, but it's in addition to Bank NATO, you actually had a great piece where you called Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist and author, you actually called him a new Ayn Rand for a dark digital future. Tell us all about it.
Well, I mean, if you follow people like Tom Rand for a living, Tom Friedman for a living, you get to think, well, he's there's nothing more to be said about him, but he's the gift that keeps on giving. And I think the reason why it matters, it's not just to kick around a silly person, it's the reason why I think it was important, it felt important to write that piece, is that people don't really always connect the dots. We're busy. We're running from one obligation to another. But the internet startups and the internet world has become the new fantasy land for John Galtian illusions of the lone entrepreneur who reshapes the world. And all that really is, first of all, it ignores the fact that every single internet entrepreneur on the planet, many of whom, if not most of whom, consider themselves libertarians in the Ayn Rand mold, are all using government-created technology. So they're all hypocrites of the silliest kind, because Peter Thiel or any of these other people who say, well, I'm a self-made man or human being, well, gee, I don't think so, because government dollars created your technology, and government dollars educated the people who can read enough to get on PayPal or Facebook or whatever your particular thing. So that's number one, is the sort of inherent contradiction of all that. But then Tom Friedman is a classic example of people who say, oh, well, there are poor people in the world, the internet will lift them up. There's an education problem, the internet will fix it. There's middle classes dying, internet will fix it. Well, that's a fantasy solution. I'm not anti-technology, anti-internet. I worked in the tech world for a while, but what you have here is, for example, Tom Friedman was celebrating something called Airbnb, which, if you've heard of it, is a online way for people to rent out rooms in their homes instead of staying at hotels, rent out their cars, rent out themselves as tour guides or whatever. And people like Friedman just don't see how the whole thing, number one, is a fantasy of privilege, and number two is a pretend substitute for a dying middle class, the loss of meaningful jobs. And this is stuff that Friedman celebrates instead of understanding and explaining. So, for example, he says, as I always like to say, average is over. Well, one of the things that just makes him so easy to mock is that he's constantly field testing new catchphrases for his next book. The world is flat was his big success. So
one that he heard from a cab driver in some country, he always hears this cab driver told me this. And
well, that's right. That's the running joke about Friedman, is that wherever he goes, there's a cab driver who echoes and reflects Tom Friedman's inner psyche. But which for me, if I got a cab driver that reflected Tom Friedman, it would be the longest ride I ever took. But yeah, exactly. So the world is flat. So average is over, which, first of all, is a very silly phrase, because you can't say that a mathematical law is over, a mathematical principle. What's next? Subtraction is over. So, it's just silliness. But what he says with great sort of enthusiasm is, you can't be average to get a decent job anymore. Well, the fact is that the average person is average by definition. So you can't celebrate. Stop and think, Tom Friedman. You can't celebrate a world in which the average person can't get a decent job without celebrating a horrible situation for the typical person. So he's saying, no, you have to be above average. You have to excel. In other words, you have to jump through hoops like a trained monkey just to get a job as a file clerk in an insurance company. Well, that's a pretty crappy world to live in. So Tom Friedman starts by saying average is over in this piece on what he calls the sharing economy. That's the new buzz phrase. Tom Friedman said, well, average is over, number one, and so we're all going to have to jump through hoops just to eat in the future world, unless we're super exceptional human beings, in which case we'll get that file clerk job. Okay, that's Tom Friedman's vision of the new future, but there's an alternative thanks to the sharing economy. And then he tells the story of this kid who went to the Parsons School of Design, I think, or Rhode Island School of Design, then moved to San Francisco with a roommate, needed to make rent, so they went on the internet and advertised that somebody could sleep on an air mattress, hence Airbnb, in their living room for a few bucks, and they'd take them around and be their tour guides. And then they created an internet company out of this, and Tom Friedman thinks this is wonderful. Well, I don't know about you, but I think that's a horrific vision of the world where, number one, you can't get a job. So, number two, you have to rent out your home, and you have to have strangers sleeping on your floor, and you have to be their tour guide and butler and valet and driver in order to get by and get a few pennies from them. And the best way to take a vacation is to rent a car from somebody who's not subject to any. It's also an anti-regulation ideology. Okay, so I'm going to come to your town, and I'm going to rent a car from a guy who's not required to get an inspection. You know, it's all very well and good until the first time the brakes fail on a downhill incline, and you wrap yourself around a tractor trailer and get killed because there were no regulations around this whole quote-unquote free market. So it's a heavily anti-middle class, anti-jobs, anti-regulation ideology, which is very much Ayn Rand's ideology, wrapped in this, feel-good veneer that Friedman's so good at, so that all the liberal readers of the New York Times, where Friedman is published, can say, gosh, this is wonderful. We don't need to worry about jobs because everybody will be able to rent out their room. Well, number one, not everybody got to go to the Rhode Island School of Design. That takes a lot of money. You got to be an upper middle class kid. Poor people didn't go to the Rhode Island School of Design. I'm telling you, maybe there were a few scholarship kids, but that's not how this thing happened. Number two, most people don't live in San Francisco, which is a tourist-friendly city, which is where these kids live. So what are you going to do? Go to Milwaukee? Go to Utica, New York, where I grew up? Go to inner-city Harlem and say, hey, come on in, folks. We're going to rent out. It's just insanity. And number three, that's not a decent, humane life for people. I mean, we should be standing up for decent lives for people, who want to be part of the American dream. This is not the American dream. This is the American nightmare. So my point in writing the Friedman piece, other than one cannot help but have a little fun at the mustache of doom's expense. I forget who called him that. But, the real purpose was to say, look, people, you're being sold Ayn Randian ruthlessness with this feel-good, gee, isn't it wonderful, let's all go to the Rhode Island School of Design and do an internet startup, which, by the way, in order to get everybody who's looking for full-time work squared away, we need 22 million startups in the United States. So that's an awful lot of web pages for everybody to visit every day. So the whole silliness of thinking the internet economy is the solution to our problems, thinking the sharing economy, quote unquote, is a solution to our problems, or celebrating a world where, quote unquote, average is over, instead of creating a place where decency and a decent life is the norm, is the average, is just, that's Ayn Randianism with a smiley face on it, or as I put it, John Galt means John Denver. That's Tom Friedman, so that's why I wrote that piece.
No, it's great, and also just like the illogic of, okay, if the average is not going to be able to afford things like food, who is going to be buying and using all these startups exactly? Who's actually going to be able to afford to do all these amazing internet companies that are going to be springing up to save everybody if no one actually has money that they have to rent out their car in an unregulated way, if they have to rent out their home in an unregulated way just to make their rent and just to barely survive to eat? How does that again, it's this downward spiral we're talking about. If no one can afford to do this stuff to begin with, who is actually going to pay for these services and goods that these startup companies are providing?
Well, of course, exactly. And, the internet, they're always talking about, well, you've got to capture eyeballs. And while you were talking, I was picturing this like nation of dead people, like The Walking Dead, just watching, only eyeballs, watching these 22 million. It's just so absurd. You're absolutely right. And it's just so naive. But, that's what Friedman is. He's a pitchman for this phony vision, fantasy world that's being used to make people tolerate very real world harm to them and to others. And that's why it has to be called out and stopped.
Yeah, and again, I think us, those of us on the left, we obviously make fun of Friedman a ton, and he is a punching bag, and rightfully so, he should be. But you're very correct in the fact that, I know I have relatives who are on the, center-ish kind of, center-left-ish kind of thing, kind of traditional Democratic voters. They wouldn't necessarily call themselves liberal per se or progressive per se, but they're all, like, whenever they see Tom Friedman, it's like, oh yeah, Tom Friedman, the world is flat. I love that book. He's so great. He's so smart. And just the fact of the amount of reach that this imbecile has, that this, idiot Ayn Rand has, is actually the most frightening thing about it. And the amount of influence that he has over decent people can be swayed by this man's idiocy is really the most frightening thing about this.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I have relatives like that too, decent and intelligent, by the way, smart enough, but very smart. But they they don't go dive into these issues in depth. They read his column, it makes them feel good. They feel inspired, but it's an illusion, and that's why That's why I more often than not will go after the Tom Friedmans of this world rather than, let's say, the Glenn Becks, because we all know Glenn Beck is a lunatic, but a lot of people don't realize that Tom Friedman is selling snake oil too. So I think that's why I think it's worth doing.